Hello everyone, and welcome to Hill Street. Today's story is, It Felt Like Silk. If you end up enjoying this story, please leave a like. And if you enjoy hearing stories from me, please subscribe and become a resident of Hill Street and let me know how I'm doing in the comments. Now, let's get to this nightmare. It started with the smell. Damp like an old shed full of long-forgotten memories. Then the mold came, stretching out like tendrils around the door to the cupboard. Big black blotches swelled up around the frame, each containing millions of spores ready to release into the air, spreading further and further onto the walls, across the ceiling, down my throat. I found her inside, badly injured, contorted impossibly, her many arms broken and bloody. She hissed as I approached, baring her crooked teeth. They looked human, save for the fact there were so many of them. Some filed to a point, others like yours or mine. Through the gaps, I could make out a black and swollen tongue. Her mouth was filled with blood. Her own was my guess. It seeped from the corners of her lips. The stench was so much worse when I opened the door to where once only a large decommissioned boiler stood. Now, wrapped around the steel water drum, was her mangled body. It was impossible not to take pity on her. She was dying after all. So I let her be. Didn't have the heart nor the courage to put her out of her misery. A thought of trying to help her flashed through my mind, but was quickly dismissed after a glance into her black eyes. Perhaps it was best that she was left to die. At night, I would hear her wheezing. It was hard to listen to, but I knew she posed me no threat. She could hardly move, and I was in the next room over. But the groaning put me on edge. It was as if she was asking for something, begging. I didn't sleep much those first few nights. Visions of her dragging herself through the bedroom door filled my head. Thoughts of 4, 6, 10 hands reaching up from under the bed. Hundreds of fingers worming their way under the covers and onto my body, burrowing deep into my stomach like rats, trying to escape a burning heat. I visited her again after the first week of restless nights, still in much of the condition that I found her in. This time, she didn't growl or snarl, only stared with those large colorless eyes of hers, perfectly round in her misshapen head. They pierced my soul. They tempted me to move closer, shuffle ever so slightly towards the ball of broken arms in the cupboard. So I did. I got close enough that if she weren't so distorted, she would be able to reach out and caress my face or pluck out my eye. Since she couldn't, I reached out instead, fighting the urge to rest my hand on the tuft of tatted black hair protruding from her scalp. It felt like straw against my fingertips. Her eyes never left mine as her lips peeled back, revealing those strange, almost human teeth. I recoiled, but it was too late. Her mouth had sealed around my fingers. I felt the grinding all the way up to my elbow. The shock of nerves screaming through my arm, and my fingers were lost to her bloody maw. Her bloated tongue whipped out of her mouth to catch the blood that had splattered onto her lips. She chewed and crunched my bones as I fell backwards and landed hard. I saw her expression turn for the first time at that moment, from anguish to glee. Then I turned away and scrambled out of the house as fast as possible. At A&E, I told them I'd gotten it caught up in some machinery, told them I was a factory worker who had tripped on the job. They believed the lie, made jokes about the payout I would get if I sued. I sat there and laughed through the pain. I knew the truth, but couldn't tell, didn't want to tell. They told me to get some rest, gave me some strong pain meds, no more questions or sympathy, just a prescription and a pat on the back while I went on my way. I don't know why I went back there, but there I was, walking back into the house where I had lost 2 fingers. Not all the way to the knuckle, I should say, just parts. I didn't go back to that room straight away. Instead, I tricked myself into believing it didn't exist. I went about my daily routine, watching TV, reading, taking my painkillers. It was as if none of it had ever happened. But at night, I still heard her. Whining and howling came from her room, more than before. It was as if she'd gotten a taste and wanted more. A tantrum from a small child who had been denied another sweet. Occasionally, I would hear the sound of the cupboard door creak open, and it would fill me with dread. But then, the painkillers would put me to sleep, and the dread would dissipate, along with everything else. For the next few days, I would not even look into her room, afraid of being transfixed again. But on the 4th day, I dared to peek through the crack in the old wooden door that led to the room. The cupboard door was wide open, and one of her elongated arms lay on the floor. A decrepit hand sat upturned, like a curled up spider. I am still not sure if she could see me too, but she stared right at me, begging me to open the door. I stared back. That night, after hours of listening to her shriek, I decided to put a stop to it. I'd had frozen steaks delivered. The one I intended to eat that evening had been defrosting in the fridge. I crept out of bed as quietly as I could and headed downstairs to get it. The only thing going through my mind as I unwrapped the meat and walked slowly back upstairs was the hope that she would stop screaming, that she would be satiated and I could go back to my life with one small caveat, a pet of sorts that I would have to make sure to feed nightly. I approached the door and peered through the crack. Nothing, only darkness, but the noise had stopped. Could she see me? Was she expecting me? It was impossible to say. So I entered, not wanting to be hypnotized by her eyes. I shut mine tight and threw the steak in her direction. I was out of the room before it even hit the floor. The thud came a second before I slammed the door shut. There was silence for a time before my meds put me to sleep, and I was no longer conscious enough to hear if she liked it. I did the same thing the next 5 nights. Not always steak, sometimes chicken drumsticks, sometimes lamb or pork. I heard no more complaints. But on the 6th night, I noticed a smell. not like the smell from before. It wasn't the damp I'd become used to. This was something else. This was something rotten, putrid. A strange yellowish squid had begun to ooze from under the door. My first thought was that she had died, and something inside of me filled up with grief. I was so unbelievably heartbroken at the idea that this creature had passed away, that maybe I had a hand in her death. So my body jumped into action and forced its way through the door, my bare feet plunging into the slop on the ground. I expected to see her there, as broken as the day I found her. But this time, her enchanting black eyes would be closed, never to open again. Her mouth would be hung open in a mute scream. Her teeth rotted out of her gums, and her arms shriveled up and gray like tumbleweed. But that's not what I saw. Instead, the cupboard door was closed, jammed behind an assemble of rotting meat, piled up against the painted white wood, squirming maggots adorning its uneven surface. The smell was unbearable, but I was unaffected. Instead, I was fixated on the door. I stepped closer and flung it open, scattering dead meat across my feet and the floor surrounding them. And there she was, head nestled among her hive of arms, eyes glistening in the moonlight. She had rejected my gifts, but she was still alive. She was alive, and she was hungry. The relief I felt when those enormous eyes blinked in my direction was so overwhelming that I almost wept. I stared down at her, and she stared back. Collapsing under the weight of my happiness, I dropped to my knees. She and I were now at eye level, and her head swam elegantly towards mine. We stayed there for what felt like hours, staring into each other's souls, the only two in the whole world. I studied her face, making note of every crease and crevice. When I cocked my head, so did she, and when I furrowed my brow, she followed suit. She felt me, and I felt her. It was a moment I'll never forget, a moment I never want to forget. A thick drool trickled from her mouth as she opened it, and I responded instinctively. Immediately, I bit down hard on my tongue. It burst. Before I knew it, she was at my chin, rapidly licking blood from my face. I coughed and sputtered blood down onto the floor. She lunged towards the quickly forming pool and continued sipping it up. I stumbled and fell onto my back, lying there staring up at the ceiling as she withered next to me. I felt a form of bliss. After a while, her feeding ceased, and she shuffled away back into the cupboard, door shutting behind her. I lay there the rest of the night, not sleeping, just staring, feeling. I left the room when the sun came up, having not heard a single whine or wail all night. She had gotten what she wanted, and in many ways, so had I. I tried to go about my day, but couldn't focus on anything but the previous night. I took some painkillers for my hand and tongue, and sat in my chair, replaying the event over and over in my head. From a rational perspective, the event seemed so horrible. kneeling there in rotten meat and maggots up to my thighs as blood pours out of my mouth into the one of a creature so foul and broken. But in my head it didn't seem that way. It seemed like a bond being forged between a man and a little damaged thing, a thing in need. I went to bed that night not knowing if I should go back to her or not. I wanted to. I'd been thinking about her all day, but something told me to go to bed. So I took my painkillers and laid down, knowing that she was so close to me, just a wall away. It filled me with a warm feeling. I left the room when the sun came up, having not heard a single whine or wail all night. The drugs put me out for a few hours, but I awoke in the night. My dreams had been filled with her, longing, wanting dreams. I had to see her again, needing to, so I went. When I opened the door to her room, she was already waiting for me. There was a sense of serenity on her face. She was glowing. I stared once again into her eyes, feeling like I could swim in them. I wanted nothing more than to be lost in her forest of arms, to be embraced forever from every direction. I fought with myself to resist the urge to kiss her, biting down on my lips to stop them from welcoming hers. I bit, almost through them, blood mixing with saliva in my mouth to create a nectar which she found irresistible. She latched on, sucking at my lips until they were dry. It felt right. Felt like I was helping her, fixing her, but not only that, she was fixing me. We saved each other. This continued for days, each night losing a piece of me to build her back up. It was worth it. I'd have given everything to her if I could. The pills sustained me while it happened, protected me from the pain and kept me in the moment with her. It was a whirlwind of romance, but it all came crashing down around me a few nights later. By all accounts, it had been a regular night. I took my pills and headed for bed. As I started to feel drowsy, I heard the creaking of the cupboard door and then a loud thud. I didn't move. Gradually, I started to hear what sounded like something being dragged across the floor. The noise would last for a few seconds, then stop for a few. This went on for several minutes until I heard a single bang on my bedroom door. She had come to me. The hinges began to squeak as she pushed the door open. I'd started to doze off by this point, but through my haze, I could see her eyes coming towards me. They would move forward a few feet, then stop, then move forward some more, in a rhythmic motion as she lunged her extended body towards me. I could still see some of her hands scuttling at the doorway, while her face approached my throat. She'd been staring into my eyes since she opened the door, but now she wasn't. She was fixed on my neck, and all I could see of her was a tuft of hair. The last thing I remember is 3 of her hands scrambling onto the bed as her mouth came down onto my neck. I passed out around that point, a smile on my face. I awoke when the sunlight hit my eyes. Since my painkillers had worn off, I could feel a throbbing pain in my neck, a dull ache, much like the ones in my hand and tongue. But not only that, something sharp too. It rattled through my body for an instant, then the ache returned. I looked up at the ceiling, disorientated. Then, the pain came back again, piercing me. I looked down, and there she still was, her many arms sprawled out across me, like a web of appendages, my weak body trapped under the weight of her ever-improving one. This was the first time I'd seen her in the light of day. She looked the same, but so much different. Her tuft of hair scraped against my cheek like a cheese grater as she moved her head from side to side, making sure to get every last drop. I groaned and wailed, screamed and whined. It hurt. For the first time, I could really feel it. The pain was absolutely unbearable, and it filled my body. She looked up at me, into my eyes for the last time. For a second, I saw a flash of those dazzling dark eyes, but then they were gone, replaced with endless pits, hollowed and spiraling ever downwards. Her mouth, no longer human, now a tangle of barbed wire and knives, lips tattered and chewed, every crease and crevice now ruptures and cracks. She looked down at me for a second longer, then continued chewing on my neck, as if I was nothing but a meal to her. I reached up with one weak hand and managed to push her away from me. Her head and several arms collapsed to the floor. The rest of her arms pinned me down as she climbed back up onto me. Once she was at my eye level, she began to scream, opening her jaw wide to show her many rows of teeth. I just lay there, powerless. She had betrayed me. All the trust we had built was gone, vanished in an instant. The moment I saw her in the cold light of day, she was using me, and I was letting her. I wasn't her carer or her lover or anything of the sort. I was food, a means to an end. When she was done, she dropped to the floor, satisfied with the meal. My head was cloudy, but through the fog I saw her scuttle away and out of the door, quicker than I had ever seen her move before. I stayed in bed all day, unable to comprehend what had happened to me, and too weak to act on it if I were. Instead, I lay in bed with a broken heart, confused and abandoned. But even in my heartache, I still felt a flutter of hope when I saw the door creak open once again that next night. The night before, the door had opened slowly, pushed gently by one of her many delicate hands. But this night was different. The door was shoved open with a force behind it, like many hands had pushed it solidly. It swung and bounced lightly off the wall. I listened for that same dragging sound and searching for her eyes close to the ground. But they weren't there. Instead, they glided through the air towards me. The light, glinting off them, made them look like magic orbs floating around the room. As she got closer, I could see her now strong arms holding her aloft. Many hands placed flat against the floorboards. The excess crawled around the walls and on the ceiling, feeling the room around me. Her hands engulfed my body, checking for a pulse. Then she descended, not bothering to look me in the eye. That was her last chance. I felt nothing for it after that. The arms began to wrap around me once more, and her teeth went back to my neck, determined to finish the meal she started all those days ago. The pain felt stronger this time. It felt like a shockwave throughout my entire body, and my brain reacted. In a moment of desperation, I managed to squirm one of my arms free and reach up to its head, jamming my thumb into its left eye. It recoiled sideways, and I was thrust down onto the floor on top of this thing. While I had my chance, I thrust my other thumb into its right eye. Its arms spun in a whirlwind around me, striking me over and over again. But I persisted. I pushed deeper and deeper into its battered head as it howled at me. One by one, its arms fell away from me, until eventually there was no more resistance. I lay there spread out across my bedroom floor, face gushing with blood. It looked not unlike the way I first found it. The pain came back to me after that. It had broken some of my ribs in the fight. I was lucky its strength hadn't fully returned. Unable to move, I laid by its body, buried in a bed of limbs. Its head was tilted towards me, and I looked into those eyes. There was nothing there, not even my own reflection. It came to me battered and bruised all those days before, and I nurtured it. I helped her. I think I loved her for a time. But now she's dead. I reached out to her one last time and ran my hand through her hair. It felt like silk,